let's talk about narrative structure for games. When we bring up narrative structure, most people instinctively think of more complicated narratives. Like, can we make a branching narrative? But I'd like to reverse that. What's the simplest possible narrative we can create that benefits games? Fundamentally, the big advantage a game has over a movie or a comic book is that it is interactive. Most of the assets in a game help that interactivity. They either benefit it or benefit from it. That piece of art over there, that art asset, well, it's built to be looked at by the player's camera. That leveling system, it's built to be interacted with every half hour for the next 40 hours. All of these assets are built specifically to support interactivity, except the narrative. Narratives usually aren't. Narratives are usually based on philosophies from non-interactive media. Thousands of years of plays and books, dozens of years of movies and comics, and so we get a lot of narrative structures that benefit those media but don't necessarily benefit games. For example, does the hero's journey work for a game? Do you have to build up a villain? Do you have to have a call to action? What narrative structures actually work in a game as opposed to just exist because they happen to exist in other forms of media? Let me give you a very basic example. Let's say that you've got some mechanics in your game and you want the story to support those mechanics. Can you do that? For example, let's say you've got an RPG with things like leveling and death in it. Can you have a narrative structure that actively makes the player want to do this and think about it more positively? Well, sure, you can just play Planescape Torment and see how they did it. How about if you've got a shooting game? Can you have a narrative which supports how shooting works and how it evolves over the course of the game? Well, sure, you can have levels where you have to use tranks, or levels where there are armored enemies, so you have to use high explosives. Maybe over the course of the game, near the end of the game, you decide that you've been evil the whole time and now you've got to be good and you got to save people and so on and so forth. You can do a lot with the narrative structure to support the fundamental gameplay that your game has. As the gameplay evolves, the narrative structure supports that evolution and makes the player really invested in that evolution. But this is not actually what I'm talking about, because this is not interaction. It's built on top of interaction. The mechanics and gameplay of your game are built on top of interaction. They are not fundamentally interaction itself. So what's interaction itself? At this point, some of you are probably thinking, is he really talking about moving through a world and looking at things with a camera? Yes, I am. For many games, the most fundamental interaction type is being in a world and looking at that world with a camera. Now, obviously, this does depend on your exact game, and there are games which do it differently. But there is a fundamental kind of interaction, and it is usually about being in a world and looking at it. Interacting with things in the world, that sort of stuff. The concept of a fight is built on top of being in this world, seeing an enemy that you can identify as an enemy, and then switching over to an interaction type that affords fighting that enemy. But the fighting itself is not an interaction. It's built on top of this entire set of interactions that we have for navigating the world, looking at things, and clicking on things. Can we have a narrative structure that makes the player want to be in this world, moving through this world, looking at things and clicking on things? Yeah, of course we can. And I don't mean mini games, because that's not narrative. I don't mean, oh, player, can you find 5 different places where the grass is glowing? No, I'm talking about the narrative itself. The narrative itself can make the player want to be in these places. How? By making the places seem like a cool place to be. Yeah, we're talking pretty simple stuff. Let's go ahead and give you an example. I'm going to talk about Final Fantasy XIV, very generic stuff. We're not really going into deep spoilers here. The reason that Final Fantasy XIV is worth discussing is because from level 1 to 70, Final Fantasy XIV's narrative is just total trash. But at level 70, they bring in a completely new narrative team, and they have completely changed how their narrative works, and suddenly it's quite good. And that split means that we can look at things from before and after, and we can really get a sense of the things that didn't work so well and the things that do work. One of the most common problems with the early Final Fantasy XIV stuff is their focus on villains. So in the early Final Fantasy XIV stuff, there are 9,478 guys in masks with robes going, "Mwahaha, I'm the villain of the week. Come fight me if you dare. Oh, I was defeated just as planned. Mwahaha." This is a technique that is inherited from anime, or in general non-interactive media. In non-interactive media, you build up a villain because that's something that is going to keep the people coming back. They're going to want to come back for the next episode next week to see that villain get his comeuppance. If you hate the villain, you're going to love to watch the villain get his butt kicked. But that's non-interactive media. When it comes to interactive media, we don't necessarily need to say go away for a week and then come back next week to see this villain get his butt kicked. Telling someone in an interactive game that you will eventually show them this villain getting their butt kicked is not as much of a draw as people seem to think. So, at the very beginning of the expansion where things start to improve, it's called Shadowbringers, they eventually put a King's Quest game, essentially, into Final Fantasy XIV. They open up a new set of regions that is essentially a King's Quest game. And it is fascinating and interesting. There's this cool city to explore. There's all sorts of new people to meet, new places to go. There's a fairy forest, and they're just like, hey, go meet the fairies. Now, there are structured narratives here. It's not like they just show you the map and let you loose. But the way the narratives are structured specifically highlights the fact that this place is a place worth being. It's a place-focused narrative, rather than a villain-focused narrative. And the reason that's important is because we can interact with places. That's kind of the core concept of this kind of game. We are a person in a place, we move through it, we look at stuff, we click on stuff. So the narrative has to try and make that place look as appetizing and interesting as possible so that we want to move through it and look at it. But it doesn't really matter how cool we make this villain look in cutscenes because we can't interact with a cutscene. We also can't interact with the villain. There's nothing we can do to that villain or about that villain. When you see a villain in a video game, you're just seeing what they will eventually show being defeated. You're not involved in any way. It's just, here's the villain. You'll probably have a fight with them at some point, and then there'll be a cutscene where they're defeated. It's like, hooray, I guess, right? And it's not that this is completely ineffective. Obviously, having a good villain can drive the player to want to do things and want to keep playing and so on and so forth. But this is an immediate call to action. Showing a cool place and then saying, look, we've structured this place to be fun to explore. The player will immediately say, cool, let's explore it. Let me give you an example of why we're talking about narrative structure here. Obviously, the team, the asset team, has a lot to say. When we're talking about building something like, level 14 is a volcano, asset team, can you build a cool volcano? Yeah, we can make the volcano look as interesting as we'd like, but the narrative structure is what makes us want to be in that volcano. A cool-looking volcano on its own is a fun background. It's a fun, screensaver. But the narrative elements that make us want to go into that volcano and want to look around are what really help to sell it as an object. And narratives are a little bit more nuanced than you might think. They include more things than you might think. For example, in Final Fantasy XIV, every city has this map of the city, right? And in the map, there are all of these little teleport crystals. While you're in the city, you can touch any of these teleport crystals to teleport to any other teleport crystal that you have unlocked. But you have to unlock them. You have to walk over to them and click on them to unlock them. Fundamentally, this is a way to pull the player into wanting to explore the city. Is it a narrative structure? I think you could argue it either way. Clearly, the concept of all of these cities having these teleportation crystals is at least related to the narrative. Their exact placement might be more on the asset side and stuff like that, but what is there at these places? Once we've created these places to go, the narrative team has to start populating the city and deciding where things should go and what they should mean in order to pull the player deeper into the city. This structure inherently pulls the player into the city because they literally have a list of all of the teleport crystals and where they are, so they are obviously going to go over to each teleport crystal and activate it. There's also a reward for activating all teleport crystals, so it's something that basically every player will want to do. There's no need for a pop-up, cutscene that says, "We should explore the city." And yet, that's the big difference between how cities are treated for the first 70 levels of Final Fantasy XIV and how cities are treated for the next 20 levels. This cool King's Quest city does have a tour. But the thing about the tour is that the tour shows you the parts of the city that would be very hard for you to parse without a tour. Clearly, they looked at what they had for the city, they looked at where the asset team was flaking, and they created a narrative specifically to support the asset team's failures. The places that the tour asks you to go are places that are important, but extremely easy to overlook. For example, the place where you turn in rarefied goods. But earlier, they had a city called Ishgard. Ishgard is just as pretty, it's just as fully developed, if not more, and it's full of, cool cathedrals and giant statues and all sorts of cool things to look at. And if you're like me, you went into the city and you immediately started exploring because that's how the city is structured. There's teleport crystals, there's things to see. Obviously, it's time for an exploration thing. And then when you're done exploring, you go to do the very first story sequence in Ishgard, and you want to know what it is? Let me take you on a tour of Ishgard. We will go to every teleport crystal and explain in great detail what every area is about, even though you already know, and the structure of the city would automatically make you look into it without a tour. We will go on this tour. We're still touring. It's going to be another 45 minutes before this tour is over. I hope you appreciate this tour. That's a bad narrative structure. So when we think about how we can have a narrative structure that pulls the player into the game, into wanting to interact with the game more, I think it's important to understand the difference between a closed and an open narrative beat. An open narrative beat would be one that creates a space for the player to explore. The player wants to go over there because it looks cool and there's things over there, and your narrative can explain that it is cool or give them a specific reason to go to a specific location or something similar, right? On the other hand, a closed narrative structure tells the player to go to a place or do a thing, and it's just taking them on a tour. It's not encouraging them to use their interaction. They're not encouraged to walk through the world as they see fit, to look at the things they want to look at. They're being told to go to a specific place and that nothing else matters. This is 100% down to the exact way that you structure your narrative, the exact way that you explain things to the player. Hopefully that wasn't too loud. I just bumped my mic. By focusing on a narrative which creates interest in exploring places, in being in places, we can have a narrative that benefits our game directly. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't have villains. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't have quests telling you exactly where to go. But it does mean that we need to allow the player to want to be in this world. and our narrative focus should be on supporting that rather than dismissing it, in my opinion. Anyway, let me know what you think down below.